the voter ID itself. There are some county clerks who are very concerned about the disenfranchisement that can lead to. There are other county clerks, I will tell you, who are very passionate wanting photo voter ID. However, when we looked at this bill, the county clerks in New Mexico were unanimous in opposing this particular bill. And I'd like to explain the reasons why, because it goes to some very detailed administrative reasons. And by the way, I am prepared to speak on both the amendment as well as the bill itself. First of all, this bill treats people who vote by mail differently than people who vote in person. The story that we heard about the lady who showed up to vote for her grandmother, if she would have mailed in an absentee ballot, she would have succeeded. And this bill does nothing to stop that. So we're treating people differently based upon how they choose to vote. And that is problematic. The second thing is, on page 2, we have on line 18, a requirement that the name conforms to the name on the person's voter registration. Now on line 6, there are many that say substantially conform, but on page 2, they leave it as conforms. I don't know what conforms means. Okay? I was talking to people before the hearing, and some of them were saying, well, it means an exact match. Other people said, well, it's a common sense approach. I don't know what it means. And what we're doing then is that we're having poll workers having to make that judgment call, and it all depends who your poll worker happens to be as to whether or not F.D. Hamilton gets to vote when the registration is Diane Hamilton. And that's problematic to have that kind of a nebulous standard. Second of all, with regard to an amendment, it requires that the document have the name and birth date, but it doesn't require that the birth date match. The woman who showed up to vote for her grandmother, if she happened to have the same name as her grandmother, she legally would have been required to be able to vote. Because there's no requirement to match on the birth date. With regard to the tribal IDs, there are many tribal IDs that do not have an expiration date. You never cease to be native at some point in your life. The requirement on page 3, line 5, is that the tribal ID must have an expiration date. This is problematic. On page 6, if you don't have an ID that conforms with regard to, with the name conforms or substantially conforms, whatever that means, then beginning on line 19, you can present such identification, year of birth, if the voter presents such identification and the year of birth matches the voter's year of birth and signature roster or checklist of voters. We don't know what such identification means. Does that mean I took a Polaroid picture of myself and I wrote my date of birth on it? It doesn't say it's government issued. It doesn't say it's current and valid. There's no standard whatsoever for such identification. What we do know is because such identification and year of birth matches, presents such identification, year of birth matches the year of birth on the checklist of voters, though, is that the way that's written, the name doesn't have to match, only the year of birth, the way that it's written. That's very problematic. I could walk up, if I have the same year of birth as Nate Gentry, I could walk up, say, I'm Nate Gentry, and they're going to look at that and say, no, you're not, and I'm going to say, but the year of birth matches, that's the fallback. You should let me vote. Okay? I do want to comment on, also this bill does not have an appropriation with it. Now, it does have a provision for people to get free IDs from MVD if they don't have an ID and declare indigency. Now, everybody who wants voter ID touts the Indiana model. In Indiana, in 2010, they issued 168,264 free IDs. The materials cost for that was $333,162. The labor and production costs totaled $1,309,093. The lost revenue to the state of Indiana was $2,187,432. There is no appropriation in this bill, but this bill has a cost in terms of what it asks the state of New Mexico to do. I do want to let you know also, everybody keeps talking about when they need an ID. And they need an ID for many of the privileges we have in society. But this is a right that we're talking about here. And I understand the need for security. But I will also tell you that I took a trip recently, and when I went through the airport, I was a few minutes early, and so I spoke to one of the supervisors at the Transportation Security Administration at the Albuquerque Airport. And I asked him, I said, just out of curiosity, if I did not have a photo ID, would you not let me on the plane? The guy said, no, of course we'd let you on the plane. We let people on the plane all the time who don't have photo IDs. A lot of people use their Medicaid card to get on the plane because they don't have a photo ID. We asked for a photo ID, but that's not the requirement. I said, well, what if my wallet got stolen? Would I be stuck in Albuquerque? He said, no. We have a few people occasionally who come through who don't have anything with their name on it. And those people, we have them fill out a sheet of paper, we have a call center we can call into, and with no ID whatsoever, we can authorize them to get on the plane. So, we need to be careful. What's the fallback that we have? And Representative Hamilton, in this bill, I think, has worked very hard on trying to get a fallback. But the way the bill is written, I don't think they have succeeded at getting there. Now, we hear a lot of stories about somebody's neighbor or somebody's uncle or somebody else saying so-and-so voted. But we don't always get the specifics. The specifics we did get, the specific eyewitness we did get in this hearing, were two cases where the current ID system kept people from voting. And it worked. And everybody else, it's somebody else. Now, the only recent time that we've had specifics was a time when we had 46 specific names of presumed dead people who voted in Doñana County. Now, to be fair, this was not a list that the person who raised it up had compiled herself. Someone else had presented it to her. But we looked into having specifics. We looked into that, and not a single one of those people were dead at the time of the vote. And 44 of them were still alive. That's problematic. I will also note, by the way, that 13 of those 46 people, when they registered to vote, they happened to put the year of their registration instead of their year of birth when they filled out the date of birth section of the voter registration, which made them look like they were over 100 years old. But think about this. If there's an amendment, this doesn't require that the date of birth match on the first ID. It does require it on the second ID, although the name doesn't have to match there. But if you think about it, if we require the date of birth to match, those people who are who they are, and they are the person registered to vote, would not be able to because they made a mistake when they registered. Voting is a right. And voting is one of the most fundamental parts of what makes us Americans. People in the rest of the world are clamoring for the opportunity to vote, and we must preserve the opportunity to vote. The county clerks of New Mexico are committed to working in the interim to find a common sense solution to how we can restore people's integrity in terms of their perception of the process. But every time someone gives us specifics about, with names, as we investigate, it's not what it initially appeared to be. We asked because of the specifics of this bill. And I reiterate, some of the county clerks really want a photo ID bill. But because of the specifics of this bill, the county clerks asked that you not approve this bill and that you work with the county clerks during the interim to find something that people can have a confidence level with when they go vote without disenfranchising them. Thank you very much.
Yes. Madam Chair, committee members, my name is Denise Lamb, and for 10 years I've had the honor and the grief of being your state election director. I see many of you here that were here 12 years ago. I put it now for the first voter ID bill that was introduced in the state of New Mexico. I stood to speak in opposition to that bill, and I'm standing here today to speak in opposition to this one, mostly for the reasons that were so ably outlined by Mr. Ivy Soto. I'm extremely concerned about creating classes of voters. I cannot understand why a person who presents themselves in person should have to prove who they are more than a person no one ever sees vote. The absentee process is guaranteed to offer opportunities to commit fraud if you want to, if you're of a mind to. In Santa Fe County, we had a woman who attempted to fill out an application and the ballot for her deceased brother. She was immediately caught and prosecuted and sentenced. It was an easy crime to catch. But absentee voting is away from the public forum. When a voter comes into a polling place, they're in front of poll workers, neighbors, challengers, watchers, and they present themselves. A voter who votes absentee is not ever seen. No one knows if someone is assisting them with that ballot. No one knows if someone is coercing them or bribing them, unlike at the polling place. We cannot create two classes of voters. I really want to agree with something Mr. Ivy Soto said about a privilege versus a right. We heard a couple of people say that you show an ID when you rent a video or when you cash a check. But that is a privilege granted you by a commercial business. It is not a right granted you by the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of New Mexico. It's different. A privilege granted by a business is different than a constitutional right. The other thing that I'm concerned about with this bill is the phrase conform and substantially conform. The sponsor of the bill was kind enough to tell us that her driver's license is FD Hamilton, but she's registered to vote as Diane Hamilton. We have other people in this room. Representative Gentry, I think, is probably a Nathaniel. And Representative Martinez, first name is Walter, I believe. And I think that's probably on your driver's license, but not on your voter registration. I've learned that phrases that are nebulous, like substantially conform, keep election lawyers in business. During my career, I've been in more lawsuits over vague language than I care to remember. And I would urge you, if you are considering this type of legislation, that you really are very careful with the language that you use. I guess that's all I have to say. I am a little concerned about the way the language is for Native American IDs. There are other cultural groups that object to photography. There are Amish people and other groups. They're not mentioned in this bill. I'm very nervous about setting up certain classes of people who have rights and exemptions when it comes to elections. I want to thank you again for listening to us today, and thank you for what you do for the state. Yes.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity, Madam Chair. My name is Lori Liaki. I work with the Native American Voters Alliance, and we are opposed to this bill. Simply put, it's not written very clearly, which means Native American voters will be disenfranchised. And how we perceive this to be is that because of the lack of money put towards this bill, there is no money for training, there is no money to really make sure, which would allow poll workers, precinct boards to challenge what sort of ID you walk in with. So we work with a lot more younger Native American people who will not be able to utilize student IDs. We also have a lot of our elderly who don't drive anymore. They're only depending on my personal tribal ID card. It does not have an expiration date, but I would wonder how many precinct workers would know which ID or which ones can be utilized and which ones would be illegal. And so, just based on the lack of clarity, we're asking you to oppose this. We have a lot more reasons, but I'll just leave it at that. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Stan Rosen, and I'd like to, as a member of the League of Women Voters, serve on their executive board and think of them as a group that well considers issues. They don't take issues carelessly. They study them, and sometimes they study them, and many times they study them. But I want to just comment on my personal experience as a political activist. I have lived in New Jersey and been an active member of the Democratic Party, working as election board worker, working as a precinct captain in the state of New Mexico. I'm on the state committee. I organized my precinct in the southern part of Santa Fe. And in all these years, I have never been exposed to the kinds of threats that are proposed by many of the people here. I lived in Chicago, and immediately when you say Chicago, Patty Ballmer said in the 1920s, Chicago's not ready for reform. Well, it has been ready for reform. And under Mayor Daley and his election board, they have the cleanest elections in the country. And I worked those elections, and they have a clean election because they have a binder system. And when you go to vote, you sign your name, they go to the binder, it has all your information in it, and there has been no serious, there are always a couple cases, but there are no serious excesses in this area. But I'd like to read the statement of the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters opposes the extension of voter identification requirements beyond the current HAVA mandates and current state law. New voter ID requirements would disproportionately impact the elderly, minorities, low-income citizens, cost millions of dollars to implement, add substantial new burdens on election administrators and poll workers, discourage voters, and depress voter turnout. The League believes that an improved and accessible centralized voter registration system is a far more effective means to address the fear of voter fraud. And they add on to it, which is a very significant suggestion, the League supports legislative efforts to increase voter participation, including vote centers, same-day voter registration, and consolidation of elections. Vote centers, which is consolidated precincts, will make voting more accessible and convenient and cost less to administer than the precinct system, while still providing strict electoral safeguards. The wonderful people who are county clerks are very competent and capable people. They do a wonderful job. They pick up if there is a deviation, and these people are the ones who have to have the tools to do the most comprehensive job possible. So just to reiterate, the League of Women Voters is in opposition to this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody far in the back? Oh, there, sir. Then I'll come back to those in front.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Robert Stern, and I'm from Santa Fe in the county of Massachusetts. We already have strong criminal penalties against fraudulently passing yourself off as a legitimate voter. There are very few documented cases of voter impersonation in New Mexico or anywhere else in America. We already have strong ID requirements. They've been working fine. Where is the problem?
Thank you, sir. Okay, we'll go over here. Yeah.
My name is Paul Stokes. I'm with the United Voters of New Mexico. And that was cast by a former felon who thought he had the right to vote and was mistaken. So that's an example of how rare it is. And the studies show that this will be the case in all of the examples that we looked at. This actually could be a destructive bill, though, because voting rights have been mentioned, and there's like 10% of the people, a number of studies have shown about 10% of the people in the country who don't have the necessary voter identification. And those tend to be proportionately in demographic groups that are disadvantaged in one way or another, students, for example. So there are certain groups that are disadvantaged more by this voter ID requirement than others. Those disadvantaged people have voter rights just like everyone else, and we need to be. And so, voter ID bill that disenfranchises them is just wrong. Last thing I want to mention is that it seems to me a number of the problems that we hear about are really voter registration problems and not voter ID problems. Maybe there is a voter registration problem, I don't know, one way or the other, but if there is, that could be addressed. But don't try to address it with something that will disenfranchise our voters. We already have a very poor voter turnout.
We shouldn't have voter ID because the poor people can't get IDs. That's his argument.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
My part here. There you are. My name is Josephine Porter, and Madam Chair, members of the committee, I am here to speak on behalf of the League of Women Voters. I'm one of our registered lobbyists, and we are speaking in opposition of HB 308. I concur with many of the remarks that have been said earlier, but I would want to draw your attention to studies that have shown that voter ID will disproportionately impact the young, elderly, poor, racial minorities. Dr. Gabriel Sanchez from UNM actually polled voters leaving the 2006 Bernalillo County election polling places, and he found, his study found that 6% of white voters, 8% Latino, and 14% of those 65 or older did not have driver's licenses. These were actual voters. These percentages to many of you may not seem to be very large, but as the candidates here know, that even 6% of citizens showing up on election day to vote, if they're denied the vote, that can be very politically significant. And to those who argue that because it takes a photo ID to fly, to rent a movie, to go to the bank, so why shouldn't we have the same requirements to vote? I remind you, it is a matter of indifference to the general welfare of society and to our democracy, whether you rent a movie or fly on an airplane. But it is not a matter of indifference to our democracy whether you vote. Voting is, as you all know, the backbone of our representative democracy. And absent evidence and proof of substantial voter fraud, which has just been anecdotal to date, there's no reason to make a citizen stand in line for a half a day at DMV with their reduced times and reduced hours, but there's no reason to make that citizen stand in line for a half a day before they can vote to get a photo ID. There's no reason to have a citizen jump through these multiple intimidating hoops when the current system effectively protects the integrity of our system. There's no reason to make voting harder, to make participating in our democracy harder. So we urge you to vote against HB 308. Thank you very much for your time.
Yes. My name is Barbara Brothers, and one of the categories of people that I'm from Albuquerque, and one of the categories of people that was not just mentioned are people who are disabled. I would include in that my mother and my sister. My mother uses an absentee ballot, but she doesn't have to prove anything about who she is if she can sign her name on the ballot or on the absentee request form. My sister does not have a bank account. She does not drive because she has a medical condition that prevents her from driving. She doesn't rent movies. She doesn't have a bank account, so she doesn't have any of the required documentation current that she could use to vote.
You know, her disability prevents her from going and standing in line, and I just want to say there's a lot of people like my sister, and I think that this bill presents an undue burden on disabled, elderly, and other people who have trouble meeting this standard. And I think the real problem where there's a possibility of fraud is with the absentee system that we have. Because anybody can get a signature on an absentee ballot form, and anybody can fill that ballot out when it comes to the address. And I think that's a much more significant problem. Thank you for your time.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Roy Strike. I live in Placitas in Sandoval County. One of the things that I'd like to address is this canard about renting a movie. I own a video store chain. I was the last multi-store independent in the state of New Mexico. We had new renters fill out a registration card. We entered in the computer, and that was the last we asked for an ID. Very similar to the voting registration process. So, to me, the voting, renting a movie is just nothing but an art. 11 years ago this month, I would have supported this bill through ignorance, because I just assumed that. But with all of the massive voter suppression that became apparent after the 2000 election, running clear through to today, and 7 years ago, I became aware of a quote made by Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich was the father of the modern conservative movement. He told his people they did not want people to vote. The less people voted, the more they benefit. That is on record. It's all over the internet. This has, unfortunately, turned into a partisan issue. In addition to that, I've been an election official for every election since 2002. We have had observers. We have had challengers in that, and I worked in 3 different precincts. Not one of them did anything but waste their time that day in the many, many, many elections that I've had. The biggest problem we have is people confused on what precinct they're in. And that's it. And if they don't match the book, and we get an address, oh, well, you're across the street at the church. Or, let's pull out the map, we'll find out where you're at. No problem. So, this bill, quite frankly, is nothing. It is a proposal to solve no problem that exists. And from a historical standpoint, I might also remind you that we had a Republican United States attorney get fired because he couldn't find evidence of voter fraud in the state of New Mexico. So voter fraud is a canard. And I'll stand with all of the other comments that have been made. Thank you very much.
Okay, in the very back. Yes, ma'am.
Madam Secretary, Madam Chair, my name is Joanna Adams. I'm a professor of political science at the University of New Mexico.
You need to speak up because we can't hear you, or move forward a little bit, please.
Sorry. Madam Chair and members of the committee, my name is Lana Atkinson. I'm a professor of political science at the University of New Mexico, and I have been studying New Mexico elections for the last 6 years, and I have been studying elections for the last 20. I want to say a couple of things about this. It is true, I have done a number of surveys on New Mexico voters, and it is true that there is a large margin of support in New Mexico if you just ask, do you support voter ID? Large majority of people will say yes. However, if you look at this more closely and you say, if you have to ensure integrity or protect the system against fraud, or you have to provide access, which is more important, access or integrity, the numbers change quite a bit, such that Democrats support more strongly access and Republicans support more strongly protecting the system against fraud. So I think if we change the question, we can get a different response, and I think that's something we should know. In addition, I think it's really important to reiterate what Denise said, which is the bill creates 2 classes of people, absentee voters and in-person voters, and those people are treated differently. And if we look at the numbers, even our New Mexico data,
we find that New Mexicans think that fraud occurs in absentee voting much more than they do in in-person voting. So we're not addressing the issue of where New Mexicans think the problems lie, if it exists. Finally, my students and I have actually tried to look systematically at the question of whether or not dead people are voting. We matched the death master file, which is the Social Security Administration file. We match that. Once you die, all your information is public. So we can take that information, we can merge that with names. We could not find evidence that dead people were voting. I would stand here and say, if they were voting, that would upset me as a citizen and as a professor. So I can't find any evidence of that. So from my perspective, at least, I have not seen any evidence to support the claim that dead people are voting. We did find evidence in one case, and let me explain, this is a problem in New Mexico, especially for older voters, where, say, Mr. Garcia died and Mrs. Garcia, and she uses his name, Mrs. John Garcia, in the voter registration file. He died, and her record was not removed, her record was removed incorrectly. So she continues to vote, right, under his name because she's John Garcia too. She's just Mrs. And she goes to the poll, she says, I'm Mrs. John Garcia, they find her name there, and she votes. That's an administrative error. That's not fraud. We found one case of that. We cannot find evidence that dead people are voting. If you have evidence that dead people are voting, I would love to look at it. Please provide it to me. Thank you.
Okay, I think this we can go here to federal now. Oh, I'm sorry, there was a gentleman way in the back. Come forward, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Committee. My name is Barbara Hatfield. I'm a spokesperson here today for the working poor in Taos County. And I'm going to be really brief. Thanks for all the comments. I've learned some things today, and the patriotism does feel good. On a really good day, 25% of the electorate votes. We have serious problems with voting, but a voter registration card doesn't solve any of those problems, in my opinion. I'm an electoral judge as well in my county. And I am a grassroots person with the working people in our society. They're good, they're honest, they're decent. It's so infinitesimal the number who would go out of their way, a single vote. What's behind that? I don't know, I can't comprehend it. Let me just say in the final statement, no facts today, no statistics, our courts aren't overwhelmed with fraud in voting. Only if it were, because if our courts had more cases, that would mean more of our democratic voting electorate were actually making democracy work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, let's go.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Maggie Toulouse-Oliver. I'm the county clerk in Bernalillo County. I just want to echo the comments that Mr. Irene Soto made earlier on the county clerk's behalf. I share them completely, every last word. I do want to provide an illustration for you of the potential effect that this particular bill could have were it to be implemented, and I want to acknowledge that the sponsor has issued an amendment to note that lack of the proper required ID pursuant to her bill would provoke a provisional ballot to be issued. I think we appreciate her issuing that amendment, although whether she issues the amendment or not, the HAVA requires us to issue a provisional ballot regardless. As county clerks, that is what we would do. And so if you are in the wrong place, if you're not on the list, or if you didn't have the required ID, even now under our current voter ID laws, you would be issued a provisional ballot. Right now in Bernalillo County, in a general election, we issue approximately 2,000 provisional ballots. It varies in terms of how many are qualified and disqualified by election. However, under this scenario, and I believe I'm projecting a conservative estimate, I can envision us issuing on the order of 10 to 15,000 provisional ballots in the next general election. And for those of you who have never been through a canvass process, and many of you who have been through that after the fact, especially during the post-election, know that is a long, arduous process to qualify those provisional ballots. We would definitely anticipate an extension of the canvass in Bernalillo County, and if we have a close presidential election, a close senatorial election, or a close congressional election, I hearken you to remember 2006, where there was an 800 vote difference between the congressional candidates, or the year 2000, where there was a little over 300 votes between the presidential candidates in our state. What that will mean after the fact, and in terms of waiting to know who won this election. There's no doubt in my mind that we're going to see an increase in provisional ballots, and I just mentioned that to you so that you all can be mindful of one of the consequences of this particular piece of legislation that will impact my county certainly, and I have no doubt the other counties in relative other ways. So just please be mindful of that when you go to make your decision today. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Cheryl Nichols. I'm the County Clerk Affiliates President. Thank you for hearing me on this. I want to commend the County Clerk's abilities and talents in studying this issue. We are dedicated to having the best legislation passed so that we do not create different levels for voters. That's truly a horrible thing that can happen. The county clerks do have abilities to look into this issue, whether it be voter registration or voting on election day, and we are committed to working through this issue if you'll give us that chance. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, Representatives, my name is Douglas Shaw. I'm the Chief Deputy Clerk for Travis County, and the issue I want to bring up is in the last election, it did have voter fraud. It was sent to the FBI and the Secretary of State, neither of which anything has come from it. I did have one race that was decided by one vote. The problem with that is this bill does not go enough in detail into what is going to happen with our absentee voters, which is where all my voter fraud was. Okay? And the reason we're opposing is because it does not have anything on absentee voters. But the one person that did win, it was by one vote. And it was all in absentee is where my voter fraud was. But we are a county that is strongly in favor of voter ID. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I think that I will stop it at this time. We have had 26 people that have gotten up and spoken either in favor or against it. And at this time, we were supposed to go on the floor at 11, and so I'd like to go ahead and go back to the committee at this time. Thank you.
May I interrupt, Madam Chair? I do have a committee, so.
It needs to go through the proper process.
And I cannot present it now?
You have to go to the floor. You have to present it on the floor. You have to identify it itself. No, that's So it needs to be, they tell me it's 24 hours just to this committee.
So then we have to wait till Thursday. All right, thank you, Madam Chair. And can I rebut some of the things that was said?
We'll go to the committee first, and then
Okay.
you'll have the opportunity to go back to committee members. Representative Reed.
Madam Chair, I have a motion to adopt the amendments.
Correct. And is there any more discussion on the amendment? Any more discussion on the amendment? Representative O'Dowd, on the amendment?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I think during the testimony on the bill, the issue was raised whether or not page 2 we were going to include the word substantially conform to, because I think that amendment was presented throughout other parts of the bill, but not on page 2. So I guess I'd like to ask the sponsors, Madam Chair, if that place needs that amendment as well on page 2, line 18.
And yes, Madam Chair, I think Representative Rodella, that was an error. We just got this morning, and I think we argued about conform and substantially and decided to change all of the conforms to substantially. Then I'm just amazed that the drafter got it out as well as he did because of the arguments, but I think it should be the same every place. Whether it's appropriate or not, or whether anyone would like to amend it to take out substantially, that's fine.
Madam Chair, Representative Hamilton, I guess that was my other question with regard to adding the word substantially. Okay, Madam Chair, so back on the bill, and Representative Hamilton, I guess I agree with some of the comments that were stated by individuals that testified with regard to creating different classes, different class of absentee versus in-person voters, and also the difference in the requirements with regard to native versus non-native voters. I have constituents that I need to protect their rights, and as inconceivable as it might be to some of the people that are here in the audience, I represent constituents that have never spent a night at a hotel, have never applied for a credit card, don't have a bank account, have never flown on an airplane, have never requested a driver's license, have never held employment other than being a homemaker and raising a family. And I think that speaks to a class of citizens that are elderly for the most part. They don't go to the library to check out books. They don't go to the video store to rent a video, but they are registered voters and come every election. They are there at the polls to vote unless they're disabled. And I can't see that I would vote for this bill because it would basically violate their right under the United States Constitution and the Constitution of New Mexico to exercise that right. Those are the things that I mentioned are privileges, as was mentioned here previously.
Well, Madam
Oh,
I'm sorry, I thought you were third.
But I think it's important that we take all those considerations into account. And Representative Hamilton, Madam Chair, I appreciate your efforts in trying to instill integrity, if you will, and it's all created by the perception out there by some people. But as was indicated earlier also, I don't think that when it comes to specifics that we've been able to prove that fraud does exist. And I would be very concerned that the fraud would take place with those folks that aren't addressed in your bill, and that is those people that choose to vote by absentee. Because your bill doesn't require anyone that votes by absentee ballot to present any type of photo ID. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's fair. And Madam Chair, Representative Hamilton, you know, I don't appreciate the tone that was used by some of the folks that sent me emails and called my office and basically were rude to my secretary that supported your bill. I think everyone has a right to come here and express their opinion, whether they support something or against something. But I think we need to observe that mutual respect toward one another. We get passionate about issues, and that's okay, but we can disagree, not always agree, but I think it's necessary that we exhibit respect. And so I would appreciate that for the folks that are here, that we continue in that venue, and that we try to work together to resolve some of the concerns that you have, because you're here representing your constituency, and I'm here representing my constituency as well, and I respect that, and I respect your efforts, Representative Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Rodella. I did want to mention that the Supreme Court, Justice Stevens, wrote the Indiana law enforcing photo ID was taken all through the courts in Indiana and went to the Supreme Court. And Justice Stevens wrote the verdict, if you will say it that way. No, he wrote the final decision, and he said the burden imposed on voters is the requirement to obtain a photo ID. Since Indiana law provided that IDs would be free, the inconvenience of gathering relevant documents, going to a state motor vehicle department and posing for a photograph do not qualify as a substantial burden on the right to vote or even represent a significant increase over the usual burdens. And in the bill, it does say that if you cannot afford an ID, I think it's $5 for 5 years, if you cannot afford that, then you are given one free. Another thing that, as far as fraud is concerned, you know, it started out with fraud, this bill. And I have not mentioned fraud. I don't intend to. I know there are cases, and people have come to me with many, many cases. I've not written them down. I've not said anything about them. Because to me, it's more important
to keep the integrity of the election. And when the electorate think there's no, feel that there is no integrity in their election system, I think it's something we need to do. As far as it being different with people absentee voting or people voting in person, there are even exceptions in absentee because they do allow people who are federal employees serving out of the country to vote by fax or to vote by email. And of course, no one else in this country is allowed to. So we have exceptions. The reason that I accepted Native Americans, I feel that they are different than any other group because they are a sovereign nation. And if I have gotten some of the information incorrectly stated, I will be happy to change that. But I do think our Native Americans are separate from the rest of us because of the sovereignty. And I don't remember what else you asked me, Representative Rodell. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
If I may, Madam Chair, and Madam Chair, I think those are meant mostly as comments, not necessarily requiring a response. I appreciate that, thank you. Okay. Anyone else in the committee? Representative Green.
Madam Chair and members of the committee and Representative Hamilton, I've heard the tribal issue, but when I read the document, this is what I read. So if we go to
Can you
page
put your
2.
mic on, Representative?
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Because they can't hear you.
See if that's better. When I look at the tribal issue, and I look at page 2, line 16, and then I'm going to skip everything and go right to the tribal. So it says, a document that, number 3, includes the person's tribal enrollment number, and number